Now here in chapter 15.5, our last section in chapter 15, we're going to pick up what I call the final thoughts, kind of try to wind up this chapter and do a little bit of comparison between the monetarist view and the Keynesian view. So, decisions for tomorrow. What policy levers should we pull? Well, we're talking about the we here, of course. We're talking about the federal government through the issues of the Federal Reserve or the government's taxing and spending authority to try to stimulate the economy during recessions and slow the economy during economic booms. So, in the equation of M times V equals P times Q, which is referred to as the equation of exchange, the Keynesians believe that the fiscal policy relies on changes in V, or that velocity itself will change, while the monetarists assume that the velocity is stable and they rely on changes in the money supply. So in the next two slides, we're going to take a look at a summary of their view on both fiscal and monetary policies and how they work. So this is going to be a relatively high-level description, right? We're not going to get into technical details, which we've done in other chapters and in other slide decks. So this is kind of a quick review. So first of all, we're going to be talking about government spending and taxation. What impact do they have on the economy? So let's go through the different items that they could affect. How about aggregate demand? According to the economists, no. That changes in government and taxation do not change aggregate demand because there's a stable V, and so we haven't changed money supply yet. So what all that's going to happen is crowding out. What does that mean? If the government spends extra money, let's say buying trucks for the Army, and so ordinarily you would think, oh, well, that will stimulate the economy. When workers are building those trucks, they're going to get paid and they're going to go out and spend that money, and that will stimulate the economy. But if V is stable and M hasn't changed, then the total aggregate demand side of the economy doesn't change. What happens is the government spending is offset by less private spending. In other words, if the government raises taxes in order to buy military trucks, then obviously people have less income to buy Chevy pickup trucks. So it's true that there will be more government trucks for the military being built, but there'll be fewer private pickup trucks being built. So if the two offset each other, or if the government spending crowds out the private spending on private pickup trucks, then what's happened to the total amount of spending in the economy? It hasn't changed. That's the monetarist view. Now, Keynesians don't believe that. They believe that velocity itself can change, so in fact you can have both the government spending and the private spending taking place at the same time. What about prices? So remember, we're talking about government spending. Does government spending affect prices? According to monetarists, the answer is no. The only thing that can affect prices is changes in the money supply using that equation of exchange, that if you have a constant velocity, when you change the money, it changes prices. Keynesians, they don't believe it can affect prices unless we're at capacity. We did an example where the economy's aggregate demand went to the vertical part of the aggregate supply curve and therefore started pushing up prices. So if we're getting close to capacity, increasing government spending will affect prices, but if we're not near the productive capacity limit, then government spending will not affect prices. How about real output? In other words, the actual production of goods and services. Does government spending affect that? According to monetarists, the answer is no. Again, it's the total crowding out argument that government spending can't change the total spending in the economy. It just offsets, or rather, it displaces private spending. Whereas the Keynesians believe, yes, that you could have an output responding to demand. How about nominal interest rates? Does government change the interest rates? According to a monetarist view, yes, they change nominal interest rates, but they don't affect real interest rates. Whereas the Keynesians believe, yes, you can affect interest rates through government spending. Now, what is the impact of money supply changes according to monetarists and Keynesians? So let's go through a quick list of items here. We're going to change the money supply. Does it affect aggregate demand? Monetarists say yes, as long as we're talking about nominal aggregate demand, yes. It changes that because there is more money in the M times V equals P times Q equation, therefore it should change. Whereas the Keynesians are not quite sure whether it will or not because the V or the velocity itself may change. Let's take a look at prices. Clearly the answer would be yes for monetarists. They believe that since velocity and the quantity of goods are relatively stable, if you increase the money supply, the only thing that's left to change to keep the formula in balance would be prices. So prices will rise if you increase the money supply. Whereas the Keynesians say, well, maybe it will, maybe it won't. So they're a little more circumspect on that issue. How about real output? Economists say no. Or rather, monetarists say no. They say things like the rate of unemployment and the amount of productive capacity of the economy is determined by structural forces, and changing the number of pieces of paper in your hand called dollar bills does not change those underlying structural factors. Whereas the Keynesians believe under certain circumstances, yes, you could increase output demand if we have enough unemployment that increasing demand, there's room in the economy to grow rather than simply have crowding out. How about nominal interest rates? How do monetarists feel about that? Yes, they believe money supply affects nominal interest rates. Do they believe it affects real interest rates? The answer is no, because if you increase the money supply and nominal rates go up, but if inflation is going up with it, the real interest rate may not be changing at all. So real interest rates ultimately depend on what the real growth rate of the economy is. Whereas the Keynesians believe that maybe the nominal interest rates can be changed with money supply, but maybe not, because we could be in a liquidity trap, in which case increasing money supply just gets absorbed into people's checking accounts and they don't put it into investment accounts and doesn't drive down the interest rate. And of course, the same thing would be true for real interest rates. So we see there's a significant amount of difference in these two schools of thought about the macroeconomy. And this leads to a great deal of controversy as professional economists, both of whom are well-credentialed PhDs, all arguing about these things. We don't really have strong enough evidence to isolate out which side of this particular issue is true. Because there's so many things changing at any one time, it's hard to claim this particular thing caused that particular thing when multiple things are changing. So that's where the difficulty comes from, nailing down accurately which side of this debate is correct. So this now leaves us with that question: which policy levers should we pull? And of course, this is a metaphor, where the word policy lever implies that you're sitting in a backhoe, and I presume you all have seen construction equipment, driving by a construction site. You realize that the person manipulating the arm on the backhoe is literally pulling a lever which actuates a hydraulic cylinder, which causes the arm to reach out, and then a different lever he pulls and it causes the arm to pull in. And you can almost, with a good operator, by pulling the right levers, you can make a hydraulic arm almost look like it's human. It reaches out and pulls back nice and smoothly because the operator is pulling levers. So the metaphor here is, does the government have a quote-unquote lever it can pull to manipulate a quote-unquote arm or a part of the economy to do what we want it to do? So that's the metaphor of a policy lever. So which policy levers should we pull? Well, according to monetarists, we shouldn't be pulling them. What we should be doing is keeping them as stable as possible, and don't mess with them, and try to get the money supply to grow at a slow fixed rate that equals the long run rate of growth of the economy. And then basically stand back and let the normal functioning of the economy work its way out. Keynesians, they reject those fixed money supply targets that the monetarists want. The monetarists just want the economy, the money supply to grow at 3% per year. Keynesians say, no, that's not what we need to do. We either need to accelerate the monetary growth during bad economic times or slow the monetary growth during booming economic times to try to, quote unquote, pull the levers that get the machinery of the economy to change direction in what it's doing. So Keynesians advocate targeting interest rates. They believe that's the best way to understand what makes the economy function properly, that if you want interest rates to stay within a certain level, if interest rates are going above that, then we need to slow the economy down. If interest rates fall too low, then we need to stimulate the economy up. And so Keynesians advocate what is called a liberal use of fiscal policy. So the government should spend money during bad economic times on new infrastructure, on military equipment, on anything really to try to get the economy moving again. And this was a classic example from the 2008 recession and also from the recession that was triggered by the shutdowns due to COVID. The government ended up sending out all kinds of unemployment checks to all kinds of people to try to stimulate the economy. That would be an example of using fiscal policy. Have the government cut checks to people to give them aggregate demand in their hands to go spending to keep the economy humming. The Fed, the Federal Reserve, favors inflation targeting. What they seem to do, and this is their announced policy, is when they see inflation starting to get too strong, what can they do? Their policy lever will be, we're going to reduce the money supply to try to choke off the inflation. If they see inflation getting too low, then they believe they need to stimulate the economy, so they add a little bit more money supply in. So instead of having a fixed monetary policy, the current Fed prefers a variable monetary policy that they call inflation targeting. And so right now, that's essentially where the debate is. When you see anything on the news, on CNN, or in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times arguing about what the federal government or the Federal Reserve, an arm of the federal government, is doing, you start to understand these are all the different things that are motivating our government officials to attempt to either stimulate the economy or not stimulate the economy. And then, of course, the monetarists are criticizing most of these plans as essentially going off the rails and not really having any positive effect, that they really should just simply ask for stability, and then the economy will naturally just move toward full employment because that's the nature of things. As long as you aren't disturbing things, it will naturally accomplish what we want it to accomplish. So that's where we are in the debate at this point. And so now, of course, we're going to move on to Chapter 16.